Of all the kings and queens who have ever ruled England, and there have been over 60 of them, only one has ever been called the Great. Not William the Conqueror, not Henry VIII, not Elizabeth I, just one. Alfred. A man who inherited a kingdom on the edge of annihilation and turned it into the foundation of a nation that would one day span the world. But who was he really? Where did he come from? What does his DNA tell us that the history books don't? And why, of all the rulers in English history, did this one man, a sickly youngest son that nobody expected to survive, let alone reign, become the only king England ever called great? 40,000 years ago, Britain did not exist as an island. It was a peninsula, a cold, wind-blasted extension of northwestern Europe, connected to what is now France, Germany and the Netherlands by a vast landscape scientists called Doggerland. Doggerland was enormous. At its peak, it covered an area the size of modern Great Britain itself. It had rivers, lakes, marshes and rich hunting grounds. Woolly mammoths grazed its plains. Reindeer crossed its frozen tundra. Cave lions stalked the valleys. And across all of it walked the first people of Britain. These western hunter-gatherers had followed the retreating ice northward as the last ice age ended. They were expert hunters, skilled fishermen, intimate with the landscape in ways that farming people would never quite be again. They knew every river, every migration route, every season by feel. They left traces, flint tools on the chalk downs, ochre-stained bones in limestone caves, a child's footprints preserved in ancient mud on what is now the Welsh coastline. For thousands of years, they had this entire world to themselves. Then, around 6,500 BCE, the sea rose. The glaciers of the last ice age had been melting for millennia, and now the water locked in ice poured back into the oceans. Slowly, relentlessly, the North Sea crept across Doggerland. Rivers became estuaries, estuaries became bays, bays became open ocean. The people who lived on Doggerland, and there were thousands of them, would have watched their world disappear over generations. Coastlines their grandparents had walked were now 10 metres underwater. By around 6000 BCE, Doggerland was gone. Britain was an island, and the hunter-gatherers who remained on its shores were now isolated from the rest of Europe, cut off by the grey waters of the North Sea and the English Channel. They would live on this island for another 2,000 years, and then everything would change again. 4000 BCE to 2500 BCE, the Neolithic Revolution. Boats appeared on the horizon. They came from continental Europe, ultimately from populations that had originated in Anatolia, in what is now Turkey and the Levant, and had been spreading agriculture westward across Europe for centuries. They brought wheat, they brought cattle and sheep, they brought pottery, and they brought an entirely different way of life. These Neolithic farmers were genetically distinct from the hunter-gatherers already living in Britain. Modern ancient DNA analysis, including a landmark 2019 study published in Nature, Ecology and Evolution, shows that they carried the G2, a Y chromosome haplogroup, almost entirely absent from Western Europe before this moment. Within just a few centuries, the genetic evidence shows that the Neolithic farmers had largely absorbed or displaced the original hunter-gatherer populations of Britain. The hunter's DNA survives in modern British people at levels of less than 10%. A way of life that had persisted for tens of thousands of years was over. These new people built monuments that still stand today, causewayed enclosures, long barrows, and eventually the first phases of Stonehenge, a sacred site that their descendants would continue to build and modify for over 1,000 years. They organised communities, traded across long distances, and buried their dead collectively in great stone chambers that suggest a deep reverence for ancestors. They were the builders of prehistoric Britain. the people who first shaped the sacred landscape of this island. But they too would not last. The next wave was already forming. Around 2500 BCE, something happened in Britain that geneticists now describe as one of the most dramatic population replacements in all of human prehistory. A new people arrived. They came originally from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grasslands stretching across what is now Russia and Ukraine, descendants of a culture archaeologists call the Yamnaya, who had exploded westward into Europe several centuries earlier. By the time they reached Britain, they had mixed with Central European populations and developed a distinctive cultural package that archaeologists recognise immediately. Bell-shaped pottery, copper daggers, golden ornaments and individual burial under round barrows, rather than collective burial in stone chambers. Scientists call them the Beaker people. The genetic evidence, published in Nature in 2018 by a team including David Reich, Wolfgang Haak and Johannes Kraus, is staggering. Within 400 to 500 years, the Beaker people had replaced approximately 90% of Britain's existing genetic ancestry. 90%. The people who had built the great stone circles, who had farmed the chalk downs for 1500 years, who had raised the bones of Stonehenge, were almost entirely gone, replaced by a new population carrying what scientists call steppe ancestry, that Eastern Eurasian genetic signature from the original Yamnaya herders, which today still comprises roughly 35 to 50% of the ancestry of modern British people. The Beaker people carried the R1b-L21Y chromosome haplogroup, today still the most common haplogroup among men in Ireland, Wales, Scotland and Western England. They herded cattle across the landscape, they traded copper and gold across enormous distances, and they may have spoken an early ancestor of what would eventually become the Celtic languages, though linguists continue to debate exactly when and how those languages spread. And critically, they were the first people in Britain whose DNA survives in clearly recognisable form in modern British and Irish people today, including, through thousands of years of ancestry, a 9th century king from Wessex named Alfred. By 800 BCE, Britain was fully Celtic in language and culture. Not in the romantic Victorian sense, but in the genuine linguistic and archaeological meaning. A people speaking Brythonic Celtic languages, living in hill forts, crafting extraordinary metalwork, and genetically descended primarily from Beaker populations with fresh infusions from Iron Age continental Europe. Modern ancient DNA analysis shows that Iron Age British people were genetically very similar to modern Welsh and Scottish people, high in R1b haplogroups, with a robust Bronze Age steppe ancestry component. These were the people Julius Caesar encountered when he landed in Britain in 55 BCE. He called them ferocious. He described warriors in chariots, painted with blue woad. He raided, extracted tribute, and left. It wasn't until 43 CE that Emperor Claudius ordered a full invasion. 4 legions, approximately 40,000 soldiers, crossed the Channel. Within 4 years, most of southern Britain was a Roman province. Londinium was founded, roads were laid, bathhouses steamed in cities the British had never imagined. For nearly 400 years, Rome ruled Britain. And yet, here is one of the most remarkable facts in British genetic history. The Romans left almost no genetic mark. Analysis of ancient genomes from the Roman period in Britain found that Roman-era DNA was largely indistinguishable from pre-Roman Iron Age DNA. The empire that governed Britain for 4 centuries, that built Hadrian's Wall and the road network that still underlies modern England, changed almost nothing about the British gene pool. When Rome finally collapsed and the legions withdrew in the early 5th century, the British people were still, genetically, Celtic Iron Age farmers. for about 50 more years. Then came the storm that would define England forever. In 410 CE, Rome officially abandoned Britain. The legions were gone. The defences crumbled. The cities fell silent. And from across the North Sea, from Denmark, northern Germany and the Netherlands, they came. The Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes. History calls them the Anglo-Saxons. And what they did to the genetic landscape of Britain was, until very recently, deeply controversial. For decades, historians argued about whether the Anglo-Saxons were a mass migration or merely an elite takeover, a small warrior class that imposed its language without fundamentally changing the population. Then the DNA evidence arrived. In 2022, a landmark study published in Nature, led by Joscha Gretzinger and a team from the Max Planck Institute, Harvard and Cambridge, analysed 460 ancient genomes from Britain, spanning the period between 200 CE and 1000 CE. The findings were extraordinary. In eastern England, East Anglia, Lincolnshire, Yorkshire, Anglo-Saxon migrants and their descendants had replaced between 75 and 100% of the local British Celtic genetic ancestry within just 2 or 3 generations. In some cemetery sites, the genetic difference between Roman period British skeletons and early Anglo-Saxon skeletons was like comparing people from completely different parts of Europe. The migrants carried continental northern European ancestry, genetically almost identical to modern Dutch, Danish and northern German people. They carried R1b-U106, the Germanic variant of the R1b haplogroup, distinct from the Celtic R1b-L21 of the West. They carried I1, the quintessentially Norse and Germanic Y chromosome haplogroup, rare in Celtic Britain, but dominant across Scandinavia and northern Germany. What happened to the native Britons? They were pushed westward into Wales, Cornwall and the far north. Or they were absorbed, their women marrying Anglo-Saxon men, their genetic contribution surviving primarily through the female line, their language almost entirely erased. Within 150 years of the Anglo-Saxon migrations, the language spoken across most of England was no longer Brythonic Celtic. It was Old English, the direct ancestor of the language you are hearing right now. England fragmented into competing kingdoms. Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, East Anglia in the east, Wessex in the southwest. It was in Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons, that the most important dynasty in English history would be born. The royal house Alfred was born into traced its lineage back to a man named Cerdic, who arrived in Britain around 519 CE. Cerdic is a fascinating figure because his name is Celtic, an unusual thing for the founder of an Anglo-Saxon royal dynasty. Modern historians believe he may have been a Romano-British leader who adopted Saxon culture, or a Saxon chieftain who took on a British name for political legitimacy. Either way, the dynasty he founded would rule Wessex for over 400 years. From Cerdic, the line passed through Kineric, who expanded Wessex westward, through Chorlin, who seized Bath and Gloucester at the Battle of Dereham in 577 CE, through Ina, who wrote the first law codes of Wessex around 694 CE, a direct predecessor to Alfred's own legal reforms. And then came Egbert, Alfred's grandfather. In 829 CE, Egbert achieved something no Anglo-Saxon king had managed before him. Every kingdom in England submitted to his overlordship. He was acknowledged as the most powerful king in England, effectively its first overlord. His son Aethelwulf was Alfred's father, a deeply religious man who made a pilgrimage to Rome, taking the young Alfred with him. It was in Rome that Alfred, still a small child, was formally blessed by Pope Leo IV. Alfred's biographer, Asa, would later describe this moment as a kind of divine consecration, as if God himself had marked this particular child for something beyond the ordinary. Alfred's mother was Osber, described by Asser as a most religious woman, noble in character and noble by birth, whose own genealogy traced back to the Jutes of the Isle of Wight. Alfred was a convergence of multiple Anglo-Saxon tribal bloodlines. He was born in approximately 849 CE in Wantage, a town in what is now Oxfordshire. He was the fifth and youngest son of Ethelwulf. No one expected him to be king. Alfred spent his childhood watching his brothers die. Ethelbald died in 860 CE, Ethelbert in 865 CE, Ethelred in 871 CE. One by one, the older brothers fell, to battle, to illness, to the grinding weight of a kingdom that was being consumed from the outside. Because by the time Alfred was a teenager, England was being destroyed. In 865 CE, the most fearsome military force the Viking age had ever assembled landed on the coast of East Anglia. History calls them the Great Heathen Army. Led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba, this was not a raiding party looking for silver and slaves. This was a conquest force. Within 4 years, they had destroyed the kingdom of Northumbria, captured and ritually murdered its king, seized York, obliterated East Anglia, and killed King Edmund of East Anglia in a manner so brutal he was later made a saint. And now they were pressing south into Mercia and Wessex. Alfred fought at his brother Athelred's side. At the Battle of Ashdown in 871 CE, with Athelred still in his tent praying when the battle signal was given, Alfred, impatient, furious, 21 years old, led the Saxon charge himself, uphill against a Viking shield wall. Against all odds, the Saxons won. But the victories could not come fast enough, and they could not come consistently enough. In January 878 CE, the Vikings launched a devastating surprise attack on Alfred's royal court at Chippenham, in the dead of winter during the Christmas celebrations, when no army was expected to march. Alfred barely escaped with his life. He fled into the Somerset marshes, the waterlogged wetlands around Athelney, with a tiny band of followers. He was a king without a kingdom, a fugitive in the reeds. It is from this desperate period that one of the most famous stories in English history comes to us. Alfred, hiding in a peasant woman's cottage, was asked to watch some bread baking on the fire while she went to gather firewood. Lost in thought, planning, calculating, trying to find a way back from the edge of oblivion, Alfred let the bread burn. The woman, not knowing she was scolding the King of Wessex, berated him furiously. Alfred accepted it without a word. The story, one of the oldest and most enduring legends in English history, became a parable for humility. The greatest king in English history, burned by bread in a swamp with everything lost. Waiting. But Alfred was not simply hiding, he was building. From the marshes, he sent messengers to every corner of Wessex, to the thanes, the village warriors, the Saxon farmers who still remembered what it meant to be free. In May 878 CE, at a place called Egbert's Stone in the forest near Selwood, Alfred walked back out of the swamps, and the army of Wessex was waiting for him. Thousands of men who had spent months on their farms, telling their families, "The king is not dead, he will return." They marched. At the Battle of Edington in May 878 CE, Alfred met the great heathen army in open battle. The fighting was savage. Saxon shield wall against Viking shield wall. Hours of close, brutal, grinding combat. Alfred's Saxons held, and then they pushed. The Vikings broke. They ran. Alfred pursued them to their stronghold, besieged them for 2 weeks without mercy, and forced their leader Guthrum to surrender, and to be baptized as a Christian, with Alfred himself standing as his godfather. England was saved. What Alfred did next is why history gave him the title the Great, the only English monarch who has ever carried it. He rebuilt England from the ground up. He established a network of burhs, fortified towns, positioned so that no point in Wessex was more than a day's march from a defensive stronghold. It was the first systematic territorial defence system in English history. He created England's first navy, commissioning longships specifically designed to outrun and outgun Viking raiders before they could reach the coast. He reformed the law, producing the Doom Book, a comprehensive legal code that combined Mosaic law, earlier English traditions, and his own innovations into a coherent system of justice for all free men. He brought scholars from across Europe to restart the tradition of learning that the Vikings had destroyed, inviting monks and teachers from Wales, Francia, and Rome. He translated books himself, Latin classics rendered into Old English by his own hand, so that ordinary people who could not read Latin could access the wisdom of the ancient world. And he did all of this while suffering from a debilitating illness that had plagued him his entire adult life. Alfred's biographer Asser describes it in detail. Sudden, violent abdominal pain, complete remission, then another attack, a cycle that never fully stopped. For centuries, historians assumed it was some untraceable medieval ailment, but modern medical historians studying Asser's precise descriptions have concluded the most likely diagnosis was Crohn's disease, a chronic inflammatory bowel condition that causes exactly the pattern of symptoms Asser records. Alfred the Great fought the Vikings and his own body simultaneously for his entire reign. He died on October 26, 899 CE, aged approximately 50 years old. Alfred and his wife, Alswith of Mercia, had 5 children who survived to adulthood, and each of them left a mark on the history of England. Edward the Elder, Alfred's son and heir, continued his father's campaigns, pushing deeper into the Danelaw and bringing more of England under unified rule than Alfred himself had managed. Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, became one of the most extraordinary rulers of the medieval world. A woman who commanded armies, constructed fortifications, and personally directed military campaigns against both the Vikings and the Welsh. She is Alfred's daughter. She deserves her own documentary entirely. Ethelgifu became abbess of Shaftesbury Abbey, a position of considerable religious and political power in a world where the church controlled enormous resources. Elthryth married Baldwin II, Count of Flanders, a crucial continental alliance that planted Alfred's bloodline deep into the noble families of France and the Low Countries. And Ethelweard, the youngest son, continued the dynasty. Now, the DNA. Alfred's Y chromosome haplogroup has been the subject of serious genealogical and genetic research. The male line descendants of the House of Wessex, those who inherited the Y chromosome passed from father to son through the dynasty, belong to the R1b-U106 haplogroup, the Germanic variant of R1b that is genetically distinct from the Celtic R1b L21, dominant in Ireland and Wales, and closely related to the haplogroup most common in modern Dutch and Danish populations. It confirms precisely what the archaeological and historical record already told us. The Wessex royal family were Anglo-Saxon in genetic origin, descending from the same North Sea Germanic populations who transformed England in the 5th and 6th centuries. But here is where history becomes a detective story. In 2013, archaeologists analysed bones from mortuary chests in Winchester Cathedral, chests that have been associated with English royalty for centuries. Inside, they found bones from multiple individuals, mixed together over the centuries by time, Viking raids, Norman reorganisation, and the upheaval of the Reformation. The most complete skeleton was male, aged between 25 and 45 at death. DNA analysis indicated Anglo-Saxon ancestry, consistent with the royal house of Wessex. But the age range did not fit Alfred, who lived to approximately 50. The true identity of these bones remains unknown. What is clear is that they belong to the right dynasty, the right period, but not to Alfred himself. In the year 899 CE, Alfred the Great died and left behind a dynasty. His son, Edward the Elder, conquered the Danelaw. His grandson, Athelstan, became the first undisputed king of all England in 927 CE, the first man who could truly claim to rule from coast to coast, from the Channel to the edge of the Scottish Highlands. His granddaughter, Edgith, daughter of Edward the Elder, married Otto the Great of Germany. Alfred's bloodline entered what would become the Holy Roman Empire. Through his daughter Elfrith and her descendants in Flanders, it spread into the noble families of France and the Low Countries. After 1066, the Norman kings and the surviving Anglo-Saxon nobility intermarried, and Alfred's lines threaded through this new ruling class. Henry I's mother was the Anglo-Saxon princess Matilda of Scotland, herself a direct descendant of Alfred the Great. Through her, Alfred's genes re-entered the post-conquest royal line and never left. By the 13th century, Alfred's descendants had married into virtually every royal house in Europe. By the 16th century, the genealogical connections had become so numerous and so widespread that mathematical genealogists could say with confidence, every person of English descent alive today almost certainly descends from Alfred the Great. Not through a single line, but through dozens, hundreds, eventually thousands of converging genealogical pathways. This is what geneticists call the genealogical ancestor paradox. The further back you go in time, the fewer unique ancestors any population has. The lines converge. Everyone shares the same ancient roots. King Charles III traces his documented descent from Alfred through multiple lines, through the House of Hanover, through Scottish royalty, through centuries of English nobility. Most people with significant English ancestry, whether they live in Britain, the United States, Canada, Australia, or New Zealand, almost certainly carry Alfred's genetic material. And the R1b-U106 haplogroup that Alfred's male line carried is present today in significant concentrations across England and across Denmark, the Netherlands, and northern Germany, reflecting the shared Anglo-Saxon origins of these populations and Alfred's own people. There is something extraordinary about this. The man who hid in a swamp with nothing. The king who let his bread burn while he sat in a stranger's cottage, planning the impossible. The warrior who charged uphill at a Viking shield wall while his own brother was still praying in his tent. His DNA is in the world. It shows up in Ancestry test results as British and Irish, as Northwestern European, as the step ancestry percentage that runs through every English family tree. He saved the idea of England. And through every person alive today who carries a trace of Anglo-Saxon ancestry, he saved something of himself too. The bones in Winchester Cathedral may not be his. His grave may never be found. But Alfred the Great was never truly lost. He was always in the DNA.